Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I am delighted to talk to Dr. David Solomon Jalajel. Good, you are most welcome, sir. Hello there.
And I'm delighted to be here again. It's always a pleasure.
Yes, you've obviously a returning guest. I'm very happy you've come back. And for those who don't recall, Dr. David Jalajel is a researcher with the Prince Sultan Research Institute at King Saud University in Saudi Arabia. He holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of the Western Cape. And formerly, he was a lecturer in Islamic theology and legal theory at the Dar al Ulum in Cape Town, South Africa, where he graduated and then received the higher specialization in Islamic law and the higher specialization in Arabic. David will be speaking today about the new atheism and intelligent design, a Taymiyyan critique. So it's an incredibly important subject. So would you like to introduce us to this subject, David?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to be looking at these two related and very important topics. But first, I'm going to give a background, a theological background from an Islamic perspective. And the perspective I have chosen because of its greater relevance is Ibn Taymiyya's perspective, because I believe he has insights that are extremely critical to engaging with these two interrelated movements that have come from the Western world today. And so, let me share my screen.
Here we go.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So here is my topic. New Atheism, Intelligent Design, a Taymiyyan critique.
Right.
So I will begin by talking about how do we know God, especially looking at it from the approach of Ibn Taymiyyah. We will go from worldly experience to knowledge of God. That is how most Muslims, or Sunni Muslims, ultimately try to establish the existence of God from the get-go, is from their experience of themselves and the world around them. But Ibn Taymiyyah's perspective on this is unique. A child is born without knowing God. Ibn Taymiyyah also holds that. But the child has an innate tendency called the fitra, or the natural tendency towards God. This is different than knowledge. An infant who's first born cannot conceive of God, cannot even conceive of anything almost, but it has longings and compulsions. And among the compulsions a child has is a tendency towards God. And this is where the fitra lies. This innate need to love God leads to God, just like the child's innate longing for its mother's milk will lead it to its mother and it will suckle. It doesn't have to learn how to do those things. Ibn Taymiyyah sees our love for God, our recognition of him in our hearts to be of that nature. Then as the mind matures and becomes aware of the world around it, the need to love God leads to knowledge of God. And this can happen without any external impetus. It doesn't require any proofs, any formal reasoning, any deduction, any analogy. This can happen just because as a child matures and grows aware of the world around it, it begins to be able to formulate this concept, and it happens naturally. The signs of God in nature provide immediate knowledge of God this way. So you still have the signs of God in nature, what you see around you, but that knowledge is immediate and it doesn't require formal argumentation.
By the way, just to clarify, in case people think wrongly that Ibn Taymiyyah is making this idea up, it's rooted in verses in the Quran and in Sahih Hadith, although he elaborates it. But this is in the primary Islamic sources where he gets this idea of the fitra from. It's not just something he's made up.
Yes, the fitra is mentioned in the Quran, and we have the hadith where Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that every child is born in the fitra, and then its parents turn it into a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian. And that is the basis, of course, for his argumentation.
Right, thank you.
And so we can see here the schematic of coming to know God. And first you have human nature with this innate longing, and that gives us a receptivity to know God. And then everything in the world and within ourselves are signs. And this gives us knowledge of God and knowledge of his wisdom and his power and perfection, the most essential attributes. Other attributes we need scripture for, of course. So this is Ibn Taymiyya's scheme of how we come to know God if our souls and if our nature is not corrupted or disturbed. Everything there is, every created thing, is a sign and proof of the Creator himself. Ibn Taymiyyah says that repeatedly. He also says the signs of God are always known through sense perception. So we can see these signs through our senses. We can feel and see and hear. And this is where these signs come from, that validate our fitra and bring us from that innate sensitivity to actual knowledge of God's existence. So Ibn Taymiyyah says his signs are two kinds. He has the spoken signs that he mentions in the Quran, and then the creative acting signs, which he creates in our souls, within ourselves. We can see these signs, and in the cosmos around us, that he says in Dar Ta'aruf. He says everything other than him is evidence of his self and his essence. No contingent existent, nothing that is possible, that is not necessary, which is everything besides God, can be actualized without his very self being actual. All contingent things are entailed by him. They are evidence and a sign of him. Now, what's interesting here is he's using the same language that the Mutakallimin use in their cosmological argument, that everything in the universe is contingent, and that from this contingency we know there must be a necessary existent. But there's a major difference here. He doesn't see this as something requiring formal reasoning. Just looking at anything, just seeing it, we automatically realize this, that the things around us are transient. They are moving. We don't have to formalize it into an argument. And he doesn't like that formalization, because usually when people formalize these things in arguments, they try to identify what are the attributes of contingency and then negate those attributes to God. He finds that problematic. He said it doesn't even get that far. It's so innate. You can see the world around you is in need, is dependent and contingent. You don't have to try to categorize it and formalize it. And that's what he says. And he says also in refutation of the logicians, he says, affirming our knowledge of the Creator and of prophecy does not depend on any syllogistics. Rather, the knowledge is attained from the signs, the ayat, that prove a specific matter that is not shared by others. These matters are known by means of necessary knowledge. They do not require any discursive reasoning. Okay, so this is Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding. Basically, we have a natural innate tendency towards God. And so because of that, when we start becoming aware of our surroundings and seeing the world around us, it directs us naturally towards recognition that he exists. Now, Ibn Qayyim is his student, and he has this observation to make, which is extremely valuable. The universe, with all that it contains of signs, indications, and evidence, God created none of it as a deception, nor constituted anything in its midst frivolously, nor created it in vain. Causes, catalysts, and reasons are the province of reflection for thinkers, of consideration for investigators, and of facts for those who cite evidence. And he quotes the Quran. God says, indeed, in that are signs for those who carefully examine. Now we're getting to a higher level of engagement with the signs. Of course, this is not what a little baby is going to do. But what's interesting is, first, he's talking about now that the evidence in nature is not a deception. So this is very important when dealing with any kind of empirical knowledge, that it's not to deceive us, that what we see and what we study and what we learn by looking at the world around us is not deceiving. It's not, God didn't create a universe that's going to lead us astray, where we'd have to look at scripture only and say, well, that's the truth. What we see in the world around us is a lie. And some people could imagine that. No, that's not the case. The world around us, we can honestly believe the world around us and what it has. And it's interesting, he talks about causes, catalysts, and reasons, or the province of reflection, which means cause and effect. Causes, reasons, the things that we look at and we study in the world and study nature, these are themselves part of the science. They are not extraneous to the science. Those relationships that we see, including cause and effect, are signs in and of themselves. Another point that Ibn Taymiyyah makes is that everything that exists is possible to be perceived. He says that which is perceptible is divided into what is actually perceived and what is potentially perceived, even if we are incapable of perceiving it. What the prophets inform us about the unseen are matters that are presently neither perceived nor witnessed by us. Instead, they are kept unseen from us, but they are things that could potentially be perceived, some which perceived at their death. And he talks about the angels and other things in heaven and hell, which means that to Ibn Taymiyyah, everything is a potential object of perception. God may reveal it to us or not reveal it to us. There'll be things we will know by looking around us in the world, and those things will point us to God. There are things that we will not know only because God does not allow us to see them and give us access to them. And they may be things that we might have access to at some other time due to other conditions or because we're in the world or in the hereafter. So this is basically what we can say about the signs of God and our perception of those signs in the world. So the next topic, when we're going to be dealing, ultimately, we're going to be dealing with issues of science and of the new atheist and others, is God and the universe. How does God relate to the universe? Because, of course, that is how a Muslim is going to define such relationships and scientific relationships as well. The first thing is, Ibn Taymiyyah makes it clear, the Creator, Most High, is separate from his creation. There is nothing in his essence of his creations and nothing of his creations in his essence. So this negates pantheism and panentheism. God is separate, completely transcendent, and separate from created existence. This is something that is agreed upon, of course, by all Sunni Muslims, the transcendence of God and not being contained within creation, nor is creation contained within him. So that is the first most fundamental distinction. And of course, we can look at the verse, God creates what he pleases. Indeed, God is capable of all things. A very important verse. This defines the relationship for all Muslims between God and the universe with regard to the creative act. If it's everything besides God, it's his creation, and it's up to him and his power what he's going to create. And God is a creator of all things and the maintainer of all things. So everything in the universe is constantly maintained by him. So we're seeing again the relationship between God and his creation. Nothing outside of him is anything but his creation, and everything is maintained and kept in existence by him. And here is something Ibn Taymiyyah often stresses. Is he who creates like one who does not create? Will you not be mindful? Now Ibn Taymiyyah points out that it is a quality and an attribute of God to create. So God, through his existence, is always creator. He's always a creator. So his creative act is always going on. And this leads us to then reconciling this understanding with what we see in the world of causes and effects. We live in a world that's orderly, that we can expect things to happen. If I pick up an object like this pen, no one's going to doubt when I let go of it, it's going to drop to the table. So a divine action model is how we understand God's creative act relates to the world we observe. A divine action model is an attempt to account for causation in the natural world, as well as for human volitional actions, human free will, while maintaining that everything that takes place in the world is a result of God's creative action. From the verses we have discussed, the divine action model for Sunni Muslims need to accommodate a few things. First, the idea that God is maximally active in his creation. He's the creator of everything, he maintains it all the time. So God is maximally active. And that all things are maximally contingent. They are dependent on God. They are not necessary. They only exist because God wants them to.
Yeah, you've actually written the continent, but obviously you mean contingent under number 2.
Yeah, contingent. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
It also needs to find a way to account for human free will. Now, we're not going to be dealing with that today. To discuss that with regard to divine action models would be a separate presentation as well. And that is not directly relevant to the questions that we're going to be exploring ultimately. So that can be postponed to another time. But the first 2 points are going to be the focus of today's discussion. How we maintain, while understanding natural causality and natural law and natural phenomena, that God is maximally active in his creation, that all things are maximally contingent. So we're going to now look at what Ibn Taymiyya's understanding of creation and causation are. First, everything in creation is by God's direct determination and decree. Ibn Taymiyya says, everything other than God is created, made, innovated, and originated by him. Of course, this is almost a recapitulation of the verses we have read. God is the creator, Lord, and master of everything. What he wishes to be, will be, and what he wishes not to be, will not be. He is capable of all things, comprehending all with his knowledge, recording all in a clear record. So everything is decreed by God, and determined by God, and created by God. There is no dispute about this. This is the fundamental belief. This is the point of departure for any discussion about nature, about cause and effect. This has to be the grounding.
Yeah.
That God is a direct determiner and decreer of everything.
And I think I just want to stress what you've just said, how important what you've just said is for your upcoming points about atheism, causality, intelligent design, or all this is a fundamental foundational principle. What you're saying here, to grasp
indeed.
that is so important, I think.
Yes. But then at the same time, he says natural causation is real. And this is what he's saying here comes right after what he said in the previous slide. On the same page, maybe 2 sentences later, we do not deny that God creates causes by which he creates the effects. So God creates everything. Everything is by his determination, his power and decree. But we do not deny that God creates causes by which he creates the effects. So now you see a relationship between creation and causation. He is the creator of the causes and effects. The third point, everything without exception to Ibn Taymiyyah has a cause. And this one, God, of course, is the creator of everything, but everything has a cause with something else in his creative act. God decrees only by way of causes that steer the decreed things to their appointed times. There is nothing in the world or in the hereafter except by way of a cause. And God is the creator of the causes and the effects, which means if you see something in the universe, it has a cause that you can find in the universe. Whether God makes it available to you or not is another thing, but every effect has a cause, and every creative act is a causal relationship that is instantiated by God himself. The fourth principle, God is the creator of all causes and effects. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, God is the creator of the causes and the effects, making one thing the cause of another. If someone were to object, if that was something decreed, then it would or would not occur without a cause. Someone said, if this God's decree, it doesn't need a cause. It doesn't need anything else in the world. It's just God says it. The answer Ibn Taymiyyah says would be, it is decreed by the cause, not decreed without the cause. When God decrees something, he decrees it and its cause and its effect in the world.
Yeah.
God creates by way of causes. Point 5. He creates all effects and creations by means of causes. This all is very important here. This is the way God creates. When we talk about God's creative act, this is it. Cause being established, an effect being established, and an outcome coming about from that. That is the creative act.
So we're
God
talking cause. So this is just to clarify: the causes and effects are real, but God causes the causes and he causes the effects. But nevertheless, they are real. That they're not illusory.
Yes, for Ibn Taymiyyah, it's very important that causal relationships are real. They are not just relationships we'll see other schools of thought have that.
Other schools of thought do say they're loose. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they must be real.
They're real. Okay,
they're God's act and they are real in nature at the same time. They have to be both. He doesn't accept anything else as a solution. And now we can see it's God's act. God acts by way of causes. Indeed, he acts by way of causes. So we're looking at God's action. When you see a cause and effect relationship in nature, you're just looking at God's action. So these are the principles of causation and creation, how they relate to each other. Now we're going to see how Ibn Taymiyyah frames these ideas in a model, in a clear and well-designed divine action model to explain God's action in nature. So the same principles we had are going to be formulated within a model to explain it, and that is what we're going to see. The first point in his model is God directly creates potency in the causal agent. Potency is a power to act. And he says, to deny that God creates by causes is to contradict the Quran and deny the potency and natures God creates, which is like denying the potency that God creates by which animals act and people have their agency. Likewise, those who make such potency the progenitor for those things has committed polytheism and granted its action to another. Now we need to think about these statements. There's a lot of heavy material in this statement here.
Indeed, it's a great statement.
First of all, he says the Quran talks about cause and effect. It describes natural causation. So to deny that it's real, to deny that things in nature are causes and things in nature are effects, is to deny the Quran. So we must accept from the Quran, even if we don't want to accept it scientifically, we must accept it from the Quran that cause and effect are real. That natural causes have real power. That when fire burns, fire has the power to burn. Because otherwise we're denying what the Quran clearly says. But to think at the same time that that potency is actually the progenitor of its effect, that is doing it autonomously, that there's autonomy to causality and independence to causality, is polytheism. So causality has to have real power, but it cannot be autonomously potent.
Right. So just to clarify, if you were to say, and I know some Christian theologians like Professor John Polkinghorne of Cambridge have said this, that they attribute to a certain not just epistemological but ontological separation of the universe from God. So there's real cause and effect in the universe that is totally separate from God, and God gives them the freedom to have their own potency to act. And Ibn Taymiyyah there would say that this was a species of shirk, in effect, to grant them their own power. So I'm just drawing that comparison with a very prominent Christian school of thought, which does attribute potency to these causes and effects in themselves. Very
Yes, he would never give it to them in themselves. They have potency. The potency is in the fire, but it's not in the fire on the fire's own, on its own act or on its own power. The power is there because God is creating it there. And that's what we're coming to now. The second principle of his divine action model is all potencies, or the power kuwas, are God's immediate and direct action. Now we're going to see the divine action part. Every potency is immediate and direct action of God. And let me read what Ibn Taymiyyah said. If effectiveness, the ability to cause an effect, means independence of origination or autonomy of creation, no Sunni ever said this. That means no Ash'ari or Maturidi as well has ever said this.
Really?
No one has ever said that there's effectiveness is independent or autonomous. There is no autonomy to causality. No autonomy whatsoever. If effectiveness means some type of cooperation in an attribute or aspect of the action, this is also false. If effectiveness means the action is brought from non-existence to existence by means of an originated, created potency, which is a cause and a means, and God's creating the action through that potency. God is creating the action now. As he creates all effects and creations by means and causes, then this is a truth. So he's denying two other schools of thought here. The first one is that there's autonomy, Polkinghorne's view of the world, or some philosophers. He's more plus pointing at people like Ibn Sina and to some extent the Mu'tazila. Those are the people he would be pointing at. He says no Sunni Muslim holds that view. Then he's talking about something called concurrentism. The second point he's denying is concurrentism here. If effectiveness means some kind of cooperation, basically God acts and the fire acts at the same time. That God has placed potency inherently in an object, and then the object acts and God concurs with it. So it's a simultaneous action on both their parts. Then he says this is also false. He's not as harsh on this position as the previous one, but he's still rejecting it. He also rejects a third position that God creates things and has no causal relation, that the causal relations are just coincidences. And because he says, the third thing he says, you must believe that God creates and acts into the potency. Basically, he acts and his action is the potency in the fire. It's not separate from the fire. It's the potency is acted by God and enacted in the fire at the moment of action. And that brings about its effect. So all potencies are God's immediate and direct action. If something has potency or power that you see in the world, you're seeing God's action in that thing at that time. God creates receptivity in the object acted upon. This is another point of his. The fire wherein God creates heat does not bring about combustion except by it and by a substrate that is receptive to combustion. And you know, the famous example everybody gives is cotton.
Mm.
And the sun from which there is illumination must have a body receptive to receive that illumination. What matters here is the necessity of belief in God's determination. So everything happens by God's determination. He places the potency in one object, the receptivity in another object, and he is the one who brings those objects together by his will. Everything happens by his plan and his will. The fourth point in his model, God creates preventative factors in other objects. Negative factors must be kept away. The conditions must be fully realized, and the preventative factors must be removed. All of this is by God's preordinance and decree. For example, a fire retardant subject like talcum powder you can pour on the cotton, and that will affect how receptive the cotton is to burning. Enough talcum powder, the cotton might become fire retardant. A little bit less, and it will burn slower and maybe to a different degree and produce a different kind of ash. But all of this is by God's preordinance and decree. Whether that fire retardant is going to be there and how much of it's going to be there is also by his decree. It doesn't happen on its own. Whether the cotton is going to be in the proximity of the fire doesn't happen on its own. But God places all of these potencies. He places the potencies in the fire, the receptivities in the cotton. He places contradictory potencies in the talc or whatever else might be there, or the water. It could be wet cotton. He would create counter potencies, and he's creating all of these things in real time himself. It's a very dynamic vision. You can see a very dynamic vision of God's creative act. He's acting within each thing in real time. All creative acts have multiple causal factors. He says, no particular cause singly brings about its effect. If God does not bring the complete set of causes and dispel the preventative factors, the outcome does not occur. The point is, whatever God wishes is what takes place. So what God puts in nature, he never makes it one cause, one effect. Nothing's ever that simple. There's always multiple causes, and these are multiple acts of God working simultaneously by his decree. And multiple receptivities and multiple counter receptivities and multiple counter causes. Everything is being placed by God within his creative acts, within the creative substances that he creates in the world. God's free will does not conflict with what we call causal closure. This is extremely important. He is capable of doing it. He talks about God's will and he does what he pleases. He is capable of doing it without this cause, whatever cause you're thinking about, since he can do it by another cause. Remember, Ibn Taymiyyah already set the principle, nothing happens in creation except a causal act. God's creative act is to place potency within objects and place receptivity in objects. That is the creative act itself. So whatever happens is going to be a cause and effect relationship and its outcome. That is the creative act. That is that's how we perceive when God is acting in his creative act. That's how we witness it. But so he can do it by another cause. He doesn't do it by that cause, but it will be a causal relationship. And this brings us to a concept in modern day science and religion, as well as philosophy of science, called causal closure. Now, there's different kinds of causal closure. Causal closure means that when you're looking at a system, whatever system you're looking at, every effect has a cause. That you can describe the entire phenomenon causally, without any gaps or missing elements. There's nothing happening without a cause. There's something also called hard causal closure. Now, hard causal closure is what atheists believe in. They believe that the causes and effects not only are complete and can be without gaps, but they give a full explanation of everything. There's nothing else. There's nothing supernatural. There's no God. There's nothing else. That the causality we see in the world is complete, and there's nothing else needed. Which, of course, Ibn Taymiyyah would reject as complete unbelief. But causal closure in and of itself, the idea that when you're looking at a phenomenon, everything in that phenomenon has cause and effect. You can trace all the cause and effects back, and you'll have a complete set. Is not a problem for Ibn Taymiyyah. It's almost a necessity, because if God's creative acts are causal acts, then everything is going to have a cause. There will be nothing without a cause, and God is free because God chooses what causes he wants and how the effects come out. God acts by way of causes, and he can do it by this cause, or he will do it by that cause. It's completely his will, his decree, his act. Nothing in the universe is anything but God's direct action on the universe. But that direct action is to manifest potencies in objects and receptivities in objects. That is his action. You're looking at his direct action when you're looking at a causal event. So let us look in summary, Ibn Taymiyya's instrumental causality. Now, this is John Hoover's term, instrumental causality. It doesn't mean that the fire is an instrument in God's hand. No, he doesn't need that. What it means is that God creates by way of this and by way of putting something there. So that's why
the word instrumental causality. Yeah. It's not.
Yeah, so that, yeah. So causation, what is this? But what is this model? Whether we like the name that's been given to it or not, what does it mean? Causation is where God actively and in real time, because he doesn't shy away from this real time aspect of God's action. Causation is where God actively and in real time creates the causal power in the created entity. He creates receptive power in another and thereby brings about the effect as another creation. Causation.
Can I just clarify that this emphasis on real time, because why that is stressed? Is it something to do with an alternative model like deism, which would say like God created the universe and set it in motion, off it goes, which is the opposite of what he's saying, where God creatio continua, as the theologians in the West call it, the idea that God is continually creating presently and pastly in future. He's not just setting it in motion like a massive machine and off it goes. So it's the opposite of deism.
Deism is probably not much different than atheism. I don't think you'd even make a distinction.
Okay.
Everything's happening in real time. Everything is God's direct act. It's direct and it's God's act. It's not the act of the fire without God's act. It's not concurrent with God's act. It is God's act. The potency, the heat in the fire is God's action in the fire. God is the one acting in the fire. Okay. That's what we call instrumental causality.
Thank you.
So in summary, causation is God's creative act as it happens.
As it happens.
So it's a privilege for us. When we see fire burning cotton, we're seeing God's action manifested before our eyes.
Wow.
That the signs of God in nature.
Wow. That's a very beautiful way of illustrating the point, actually.
When you see cause and effect, it should give you faith. Because you're seeing the manifestation of God's action in real time. That is what God's given us the power to do, to see these things.
Wow.
And to reflect upon the world and come to knowledge of him. Here's the example, which everybody loves, the fire and cotton example.
Yes.
God creates combustive potency in the fire in real time. At the moment the fire is burning the cotton, God is creating its potency. It's being created at the time by God as his act. He's creating the receptivity in the cotton. He creates receptive potency in the moisture within the cotton. You know, cotton is going to have some moisture in it, otherwise it would be powder. And that moisture is delaying or preventing or qualifying the type of burning that takes place. What is it created? What is the other new creation that God is going to create? He creates ash. When the cotton burns, it becomes ash. And yes, the amount of water may have an effect on the color of the ash, or the quantity of the ash, or the nature or quality of the ash.
Wow.
So all these things are brought together by God, and the creation of the ash is created. It's not that God just creates ash, with nothing. He creates ash. He is the creator of the ash. But how does God create ash? What is the creative act itself? It is God creating potency in the fire to burn, receptivity in the cotton to be burned, and a resistive power he creates in the moisture in the cotton to prevent that burning. And through that, an exact type of ash, exactly the way God decreed it in his knowledge, will be produced exactly the way God wants it and exactly the way he decrees it. This is Ibn Taymiyya's divine action model.
Extraordinary.
Now, how are different aspects of nature to be understood on this model? What are objects? They are the created matter of the universe. God creates all the matter of the universe, and it is acted upon by God in immeasurable ways. The creative matter, the things we see around us, including our flesh and blood of our own bodies, is what God acts upon. He creates it and he acts through it and he acts upon it. What are causes? Potencies and receptivities that God creates directly in entities, through which he brings about an effect, his other creations, as another created entity. So what are the natures? He believes the objects have natures. Fire has a nature to burn, but how do we explain that with respect to God? How do we explain that metaphysically? Physically, we just say, for scientists, fire burns, it has heat, we can say this chemical makes salt if you mix it with that chemical. Yeah, that's fine. But how do we explain that metaphysically with relation to God? A nature in an object is a particular potency that God consistently creates in a particular created entity. It's God's will that he creates a potency to burn in fire. He creates receptivity in cotton. He could do it the other way around. He makes it clear. If God wanted to, he could do it some other way. But that's the way he does it. He decides to create potency of burning in fire, potency of resisting burning in water, receptivity to be burned in cotton. And by God consistently doing that, he constitutes a nature of matter. Because different pieces of matter are going to be given different potencies in real time by God. And he does so in a consistent way, and those are the natures we see. Finally, how would we understand chance? Chance is real. If anybody says it's not real, I say roll the dice and tell me ahead of time what the answer is going to be. If you can't do it, don't tell me there's no chance in the world. But it doesn't mean that God is not completely and totally in control of it, knowing ahead of time what's going on, just because we can't. What is chance? It's a consequence of the infinite richness of God's countless, deliberate, and decisive acts in nature. Remember, nothing has a single cause. That roll of the dice has 1,000,001 different things happening, influencing it. The way your hand lets go of the dice, the way the air pressure is around the dice, what happens when it hits a table, the resistance of the table, the transfer of kinetic energy. All of those things are God's direct actions, and they are multiple. There are millions of actions going on directly and by God's control. He is manifesting potencies and receptivities and resistances and everything. And it is very complex, beyond our ken. And so that explains chance and randomness in nature.
So just to clarify, there is no chance then in nature, according to it, but there is no such thing as chance. It doesn't exist.
Now,
it's possible.
How can it not exist? What we're saying is you're looking at it from two different perspectives. If chance did not exist in nature for us, then there would be no justice when the Prophet Muhammad, when he wanted to have who was going to travel with him, to have him draw lots. Because if it wasn't for the chance element there, it wouldn't be fair.
No, but, right? but did he? I'm not sure if the Prophet, upon him be peace, thought there was just random chance. Was that not an attempt to understand the divine will? Because what you described here is a total determinism of everything in the universe as a consequence of God's deliberate actions. If that's the case, then there can be no real chance in an absolute sense. We may perceive the rolling of a dice to be random, but that's just our limited perception, which is actually erroneous, because it is, as you say, a consequence of countless deliberate and decisive actions by God. So in the realist sense, there is no chance at all then. Would that be the case?
That depends on how you want to define reality. I have a problem with that only one way. I agree with you. What you're saying is 100% true. It's 100% true. Everything is decreed by God. There is nothing that is not decreed by God. Everything happens exactly as God decrees. Everything is determined by God. There's no question about that. But among the things that's determined by God is the chance experiences we have.
All right.
When I roll the dice, God must want it to be that way for me. So if it's not real in that sense, at least, that means God obviously wills for me to experience a random pattern. When I take sand and I throw it on the ground and it scatters, the sand grains are not interacting with each other, they're interacting with the air. So their pattern when they land is random with respect to each other. The grains are not lining up in rows. Okay? Now, if I take a funnel and walk with the sand and make rows, it's different. That difference is there, not just for me. God must also want me to see that difference. He must want that difference to be there. Yes, every sand grain that hits the ground is by God's strict determination. No grain is a millimeter or a fraction of a millimeter or a plank's length off of where it's supposed to be by God's decree. But by God's decree as well, I recognize that this is a random distribution of sand, and that other distribution in the rows is not random. Is that not real? Isn't that what God created? So does he create that distinction? Does he give me a brain to see that distinction? So I understand what you're saying, but I have trouble saying that anything that God puts in nature is not real just because it's his determination. Like the natures in the fire. God didn't have to put the nature in the fire to burn, but he chose of his will to decree that he will act by putting the potency of burning in fire and the receptivity of being combustible in cotton and the potency of resisting burning in the moisture. He decided that. So when we see, and he says those things are real. Now he says you must believe that natural causation is real because the Quran says so. It's real because God manifested. So if God manifests that the rolling of the dice is a chance for me, of course for God it's determined by him. But if he manifests that in my experience it's going to be chance, does that mean that that experience is not real, or is it real because that's what God wanted to manifest in the world?
It seems paradoxical, but I'm not going to push the point. It just seems rather paradoxical to me.
We have to distinguish between our experiences that God decrees for us real, because God decrees them, or are we going to deny the reality because metaphysically God is in control of everything? He's also in control of our experiences. So there's different ways of looking at it.
Okay.
And one way of looking at it, yes, you could say that if we mean that chance acts can only be real if they're metaphysically real. Nothing in nature actually has any ruling. What we see in nature, we're not going to even consider. We only consider the relationship to God. Then, of course, the relationship to God, everything is God's decree. And Tamiya makes it clear. Everything is by God's direct decree and determination. Nothing is accepted from that. So if you're looking at it metaphysically, yes, definitely. So definitely, that is the case. So now we're going to look, by comparison, before we go on to our second part of our topic, I would like to briefly compare Ibn Taymiyya's divine action model with the two other models that exist in Sunni Islam. Yes. Also because they do differ from each other.
Yes.
But interestingly, they agree with each other in certain points that are relevant to engaging with things like New Atheism and the Western ID movement.
Yep.
And they agree on certain issues that are valuable for us there as well. So other Sunni divine action models, we have Asharite occasionalism. Now, what would they say causation is? To them, causation is where God creates one entity on one occasion, another at another occasion, and as a customary pattern. Basically creates one thing on the occasion of another. Nothing has any potency, nothing has any receptivity, everything is inert on the metaphysical level. They also don't want you to pretend there's no causation on the natural level. Imam Ghazali, who was an advocate of this position, says if you don't think causes are real in nature, if you're going to go out there and not eat dinner and not think you're going to starve to death, you're crazy. He told you insane. But metaphysically, with respect to God, this is what he says is going on. So in summary, causation is a relational pattern that God's timeless act, not real time, his timeless act manifests in the world. So he has one timeless act manifest all patterns in the world. The example again would be cotton. We're going to use the cotton example for everybody. God creates ash in the place where he used to create cotton fibers when he brings the fire in contact with the cotton. So God's creating fire atoms, whatever, and he's creating cotton atoms. He brings them together. So when he brings them together, he decides that he's going to not create in certain places cotton atoms. They're not, of course, I'm just using very simplistic terms. He's going to create ash atoms in their place, or molecules or whatever. So the fire has no potency to burn and cotton has no receptivity. Just God, on the occasion where God brings the fire and cotton together, he stops creating cotton in some places and starts creating ash instead.
Okay,
so it's just a relationship.
Can I just clarify, putting in slightly different language, in Western philosophical language, the language of ex nihilo, the idea that God creates out of nothing as a sheer act of will. Are we to understand in the Asharite occasionalist model that God creates absolutely ex nihilo every infinitesimally small millisecond, if I can put it that way, everything that happens? Is that there's endless slices of direct creation, like the creation of the universe itself?
Yes.
For
Asherites, you could say that. You could argue that for some of them, at least, ex nihilo creation is always going on. It's not just the universe as ex nihilo creation as first moment. Every moment, everything is created from nothingness.
Wow.
And it's only the way of God relates those creations together that gives us the patterns that unfold in nature.
Okay.
That is, so yes, you could argue that, especially for some of them that create what's called time atomism. The Asherites would believe that time itself is created at every moment. Would definitely agree on that.
Gosh. Okay.
So let us go to the. Now we can summarize for Asherites the same thing. Objects are, God creates them and constantly sustains them in time and space. Like you said, he recreates the objects at every moment. What are causes for an Asherite? The relational patterns enacted by God, constantly creating things on the same occasion. God decides to create ash on the occasion he creates fire and cotton at the same place. God creates cotton, he creates fire, and he decides he's going to create ash at that time. He's going to relate them together. It's just a relationship. There's no actual potency anywhere. So what would natures be? They would just be a consequence of consistent patterns in God creating things. Whenever there's fire and cotton around, God will create ash. And he will not create the ash in the fire. The fire doesn't turn to ash. The cotton turns. He creates ash instead of cotton and leaves the fire alone. So you see the pattern that emerges, the pattern of fire burning cotton. That's what it means. And what are chance patterns? Well, they're just patterns enacted by God in nature, where outcomes cannot be predicted. So when God makes it easy for us to predict something, like the cotton and fire example, we know what's going to happen because God has made it easy for us to predict. Now, if God decides that when you roll the dice, he's going to create it landing as a 1, or create it landing as a 2, or create it, and he's not going to make it consistent so you can predict it, that would be chance. It's God enacting a pattern of a relationship where we can't predict the outcomes.
It's interesting as a random footnote in a way, the philosopher the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century is a curious kind of similarity with this, and he was an atheist, I think, saying that the causality was an illusion. There was no real causality in the nature of things. That was an appearance born of custom and familiarity with the way things operate, but there was no real intrinsic causality in a cause and effect in the world around us. And I'm not saying this is the same as the Asherite view, but there is a curious kind of similarity in some ways.
There is a curious similarity, and when it comes to Descartes and Malebranche and others as well, and there is evidence. Nazif Mukhtaroglu has traced this idea. And Western philosophers often like to think that they come up with things, but he showed that Ghazali's and early Asherite understandings of occasionalism were reproduced by Ibn Rushd, Averroes.
Yeah.
In his commentaries, he was refuting it. He didn't like it, but he would discuss it. And of course, people like Thomas Aquinas and Europeans and the Neo-Averroists, the Christian Averroists are one of the last great Greek philosophical school were followers of Averroes in Europe. They would know about occasionalism from the Muslims, and then they would pick up the idea, and some of them thought, "Hey, this is a good idea." So he traces it back to the Muslim world and shows that the people that were promoting this had access through Ibn Rushd and through writings of others that were writing about Ibn Rushd to these ideas. So it may not be so original for them as well.
No, indeed.
And they do have their differences. People also about how they are different, how especially Hume's position is different than Asherite occasionalism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting topic in and of itself.
Absolutely.
The next one is early Maturidite concurrentism. And this is an understanding of Imam Maturidi's understanding, especially explored by Ramon Harvey. He's doing a lot of work recently in this. And there's an upcoming paper that'll be coming out probably next year where he fleshes this out in greater detail.
Oh, I just want to say about Ramon Harvey's, about Ramon Harvey's book on this. It is actually available free, courtesy of the Templeton Foundation. I know this because Raymond actually tweeted this a couple of days ago on Twitter. You can download this book for free from the Edinburgh University Press website. All legal, it's all paid for, all quite proper. So you can read about Maturidi concurrentism to your heart's content in his work.
Now we're going to go a little bit deeper. I have access to discussions with him as well as to his future writings, but a good portion of what I'm going to be reviewing today is available in that book.
Yeah.
What is causation then? Causation, according to this understanding of Imam Maturidi's discussions, is where God creates power to act as an inherent disposition of a created entity. So it's inherent in the entity by its nature, that is compelled by God to bring about the effect in another created entity. Now, this is important to understand the distinction here. What God creates, he creates substances with different qualities or accidents. These accidents differ from each other. The different accidental qualities and attributes something has in their dispositions, like a disposition to burn. And God is creating that disposition in the quality of a substance. So it's inherent to the substance.
Yeah.
A disposition is something that is being compelled by God to act in a certain way. So the disposition has an inherentness to the object. So what does this mean? Causation is God's creative act of manifesting dispositions and entities that necessarily act by his compulsion. The difference here between this and what Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, so Ibn Taymiyyah is God acting directly in the fire at the moment of action. God creates the potency to burn in the fire at the moment of action. It's imposed upon the fire. Where for Maturidi, it's a quality. God creates things by bundling qualities together. A substance is nothing more than the sum total of its qualities. God creates a whole bunch of qualities and puts them together, and that creates the substance. And these qualities are compelled to behave in certain ways. And they interact with each other, and that produces the nature, the potency, and the quality of the object. So the object has the intrinsic quality to burn if it's fire.
Of course, Ibn Taymiyyah would say that was shirk, wouldn't he? I mean, he would say that.
No, I probably wouldn't say it was shirk.
No,
it's not that different. He would say a shirk because it wouldn't say that shirk at all, and we'll see why when I get to the comparison.
Okay.
There's no independence. What Ibn Taymiyyah hates is autonomy of the causal life. There's no autonomy here.
No, there's no autonomy.
It's just an understanding of where the locus of the creative act is.
Okay.
For Ibn Taymiyyah, God directly creates the potency in the fire at the moment of burning. It's a real-time thing. Where for Maturidi, God is creating a disposition in a quality of an object. And his creative act is compelling these dispositions. It's his compulsion to make this disposition a burning disposition that actually makes one quality different than the other. How is heat different than redness? Redness is a quality, because redness has a disposition to give off a certain wavelength of light, where heat gives off a combustive or a temperature-raising potency. So these are all being compelled by God in the natures. So it's still, there's no autonomy to anything. Nothing's happening except by God's direct action.
So there's no shirk. There's nothing wrong with this in that sense.
I don't think they would disagree with each other, because this is a type of concurrentism, and Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't like it. But he's not going to call this shirk. The thing that shirk is giving causal autonomy. And he said, remember, this is something he said no Sunni Muslim had ever said. The thing that he says is polytheism is something he says no Sunni Muslim has ever said. He's not accusing Ash'arites of this, or Maturidites of this, or anybody of this. Among Sunni Muslims, he just disagrees with their interpretations and models.
Thanks for the clarification.
Okay. God creates fire as a substance which includes a quality of heat with a disposition. That quality has a disposition for combustive potency. This quality is the locus of the disposition of combustion, which by its nature is being compelled by God to burn.
Yeah. Okay.
So we can look at then again, compare the same comparison. What are objects? For Maturidi, it's a bundle. There's no atoms. There's no substance except that a substance is a bundle of qualities. Basically, an object, a rock, a tree, a fire, a cotton, is nothing but the sum total of its attributes. So God creates qualities, and each of these, you might have millions of little qualities that make up your physical substance. And those physical qualities are all contradicting each other and fighting each other and doing different things. And God is creating each one and compelling its specific disposition. And that disposition is its potency. He's compelling it, and it's all acting together. And the sum total of all of that is the object that we would recognize as a rock, a tree, a bird, or whatever we're looking at. What is causation then? God's creative act of manifesting dispositions in the qualities of created entities that are compelled, these dispositions are compelled to bring about their effects. The natures of objects, and Imam Maturidi is probably more emphatic that objects have natures than Ibn Taymiyyah. He was probably the most emphatic about asserting the natures. Ibn Taymiyyah is as well, where the Ash'aris aren't too concerned with that. The natures is just something we observe as a relationship. For Maturidi, it's a cumulative effect of all the compelled dispositions that are inherent to a substance bundle of attributes. Remember, a bundle of attributes is what a substance is. It's basically a sum total of all of its qualities, and each of those qualities has a disposition that makes it its unique quality, and that disposition is being compelled by God to act in a certain way. And what would chance be for Maturidi? Is again the consequence of the infinite richness of these various accidental qualities that are being held together by God in the myriad entities, because any single entity would have qualities that are actually resisting each other. Maturidi says that nothing is held together except by God, because each attribute or each quality is going to have going its own direction and doing its own thing by the potency God is placing in it, and the only thing that holds it together is God. He's perpetually holding together these accidents. Where the Asherite says he's constantly recreating the accidents, for the Maturidi, he's perpetually holding them together and changing them and manifesting them. And that's how we see objects in the world, and that's how they're dynamic, and the objects change because of the way God is holding together all of these conflicting and complementary qualities.
I just want to add again, you put at the bottom there, C. Harvey, Transcendent God, Rational World, Edinburgh. That's University of Edinburgh Press, 2021. Yes. You can download that book for free from Edinburgh University's website. It's all paid for. It's all legal. I've done that myself. So if you want to read further, do download that book.
Yes. Yes, and of course, if you don't know how to get there, just type the title and Edinburgh Press, and it will take you to the page, and everybody knows how to do that.
Yeah.
So here is the common features. This is why I went through this. The DAMs is divine action models. Remember, a divine action model is the way a theologian accounts for God's action, which all Sunni Muslims agree, everything is by God's action, everything is by God's decree. As you said, nothing is actually chance when it comes to God, because everything is his determination decree. How do you reconcile that with what you see in nature of natural causation, natural processes, nature's objects having different natures, and random events taking place, which we see, all these things? How do you account for all of that with respect to God's action? That's a divine action model. We have three of them here. We can compare them. Occasionalism is where God creates the object that is the cause. He creates the object that is the effect, the object acted upon, and he creates the effect all at the same time. It's just a relationship. There's no potencies at all going on anywhere.
No.
Concurrentism, we're looking at Imam Maturidi's early Maturidi concurrentism. The object that is the cause directly brings about the effect and the object acted upon by God compelling its attributes, by compelling the intrinsic natures of its attributes. Instrumentalism, that's Ibn Taymiyya's model, and the main focus of our presentation today, is God creates causal power directly and immediately in the object, receptivity in the other, and brings about the consequent effect. So God is imposing the potencies in real time. He's not just creating them as attributes within the object. He's imposing them in real time at the moment of action. That's a distinction between the three. So let's look at the second row. Occasionalism says God creates everything directly. Nothing has any potency. For the concurrentism of Maturidi, God creates by compelling potency already inherent in the creative substance. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, God creates through potency he directly manifests in his creative substance at the time of action. Now, the yellow lines here are where they're all in agreement. God is maximally active, occasionalism. Everything is God's direct and immediate action. Maturidi concurrentism, God is maximally active. Everything that you see is God's direct and immediate action. Ibn Taymiyyah's instrumentalism, God is maximally active. And yes, I will repeat myself because this is important. Everything is God's direct and immediate action by his decree. No one's disagreeing on that. Creation, the fourth row, creation is maximally contingent on God. Nothing happens except what God decrees exactly as he decrees it. It's his action that brings it about. Maturidi concurrentism, creation is maximally contingent on God. And again, with Ibn Taymiyyah, without a shadow of a doubt, creation is maximally contingent on God. So this is very important.
I just wanted to thank you very much and praise you for these incredible slides, David, that you have produced. They are extremely clear. I like the way they are ordered in these columns and the way you brought out the contrasts and the the similarities. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, and I hope everyone sees it that way, and I hope it stays that way at the end of the presentation. This point of agreement is very significant when talking about science and religion and philosophy of science and other issues, because many people that are arguing on these other positions are arguing that like different processes in nature undermine God's creativity because they're applying too much causality or applying chance to something else or giving chance an explanatory power. This is irrelevant here. All those things themselves are God's direct and immediate actions, according to all three Sunni divine action models. And this brings us to the first implications of the model. Now I'm going back now, I'm going to be focusing on Ibn Taymiyya's model, because this is Ibn Taymiyya's presentation. I just was comparing his position to the position of some others. So the implications of Ibn Taymiyya's divine action model, how do we understand the issues of naturalism? Now, when we say naturalism, there are actually two different topics that we have here. One is called metaphysical naturalism or ontological naturalism. Some call it philosophical naturalism. Whatever name you want to give it, it's atheism. And it is the belief that the physical, observable universe is all that exists, or at least the full reflection of reality. According to Ibn Taymiyya's instrumental causality and the other two divine action models as well, that's complete opposition. There's nothing here. Everything is God's direct action. So yes, no matter what your status on the reality of causation, where Ibn Taymiyya says you must accept causality as real in the natural world, and not just a pattern, but real potency in nature, and definitely the Maturidis would say that as well. That isn't the whole picture. No. This is God's direct and immediate action. This is God acting. When you see causation, you're seeing God's actions and the outcomes of his actions. You're not seeing something else. There is a metaphysical, supernatural dimension to it. You cannot deny that. Nothing's just happening autonomously. Wherefore, metaphysical naturalism, of course, you're going to have the idea that this is all there is. So yes, that is atheism, unbelief. Okay? Then you have something else called methodological naturalism. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this by people on all sides of the debate, because everybody who is anti-religion or anti-science doesn't really want methodological naturalism to have any kind of legitimacy. Both the scientific atheist and the anti-scientist people want to deny legitimacy to any kind of methodological naturalism because they want to force people, into this dichotomy. Methodological naturalism is the idea, it's a working assumption. Working assumption is the key here. It's a method. It's nothing more than a method. It cannot, by definition, have any metaphysical claims that it can make. It's a working assumption that nature can be successfully studied without employing or appealing to supernatural means. What would it mean to employ a supernatural means? A seance. You're going to do a seance or use a Ouija board. What is the melting point of lead under standard temperature and pressure? Well, let's get out the Ouija board and move it around and see if it will tell us. That would be using supernatural means, okay? Or appealing to supernatural means. To say, well, we've been studying this phenomenon of what's happening with these kind of stars for 10 years, and we have yet to come up with any kind of explanation to explain it. Why don't you say it's a miracle? God just did it that way. Well, if you believe in God, yeah, we accept that already.
I can see where you're going with it. I can see where you're going with it. Yeah.
An atheist would say, well, you're bringing up God. But a Muslim would say, well, we already know that. Yes. When I spill my tea on the floor, it hitting the floor is also God did that. It doesn't give me any more information. I mean, it's true. It's absolutely true. The star's behavior is God's direct and immediate action. But we know that already. We're not learning anything new about the star by just saying that. So the general compatibility here would be because what is methodological naturalism if it's truly methodological? Now, what most people try to bandy about. It's just studying the relationships between objects, the causal relationships that exist in the world, and seeing how they fit together. Once you start making claims, metaphysical claims about it, you've left science and you've gone back to metaphysics. You're saying you're going to give a metaphysical account for what you're observing. But just observing the causal patterns and seeing how they fit together and making models of it, that would be what methodological naturalism is. Just modeling and tracking and taking account of the causal relationships and how they relate to each other. Once you start giving metaphysical claims, you've then done more. The metaphysical claim that the scientists like to give is that God doesn't exist. That's a big jump. And that brings you to methodological naturalism. So let's see how would, now we're bringing you, to ontological naturalism. Now, how would, in a Taymiyyan perspective, of methodological naturalism be? If someone is practicing that in their vocational life. Remember, it's a vocational practice. It is not an ideological practice. It can't. Once it becomes that, then you've lost it. Once you've turned it into an ideology, and a lot of people do. They take methodological naturalism and make it an ideology, and then they've left it, and they've become something else. They can no longer claim it's just methodological. They're lying at that point. But if we're keeping it methodological, let's look at what it means. The study of nature is none other than the study of God's innumerable actions and interactions that he carries out through the created matter of his created universe. We're looking at those patterns and seeing what they are.
Yeah, that reminds me, by the way, there's a current professor of theoretical physics at the University of Oxford. I forget his name. He's a Dutch guy. He's actually a Christian. And the definition there, number one, is almost verbatim what he has said publicly. His understanding of the relationship between God and the physical world is the customs. He is observing the customs of God in nature when he does his physics. So it just struck me that definition was also given by a Christian professor of physics at Oxford now.
Again, yes, that is true. Now, the methodological naturalism isn't going to be saying this. That's a method is a method. But how would a person who's a believer in God apply the method? This would be the underlying belief that you'd have. Instrumental causality, which is Ibn Taymiyya's model, as a model of God's action, allows scientists to assume and seek the causes in nature that God creates in things to bring about his will. This is important because the assumption, the working assumption that a scientist has, this is what makes allows you to do methodological naturalism. Doesn't mean it's true. You don't have to believe it's true. You can say, but you have to have this working assumption that what I'm looking for should have a cause. Now, for an Asherite occasionalist, they could still have that working assumption, but they don't believe it's always going to be true because they believe it's just a coincidence. For Ibn Taymiyya, yes, Ibn Taymiyya already said on a metaphysical level, God creates by causes. Everything in this world and in the hereafter, even in paradise, has a cause. Cause and effect will be there too. Nothing exists without a cause. So Ibn Taymiyya is taking the assumption, he says metaphysically, that is God's action. Since God's action, when God creates, the creative act, at least from our perception of it, is a cause and effect relationship. That's what it is. When we see God acting in the world, we see cause and effect. That is God's creative act in its embodiment. So then, not only is it a good assumption, it's what Ibn Taymiyya insists is a metaphysical reality of God's creative act. So definitely, a scientist should feel comfortable, if they're a Muslim scientist, to make that assumption. Where for an Asherite, they say you can still make that assumption because those are God's habits, and God habitually does create cause and effect relationships. But he doesn't have to, and maybe he doesn't. But you can still assume it because it's the general norm of God in his nature. But for Ibn Taymiyya, it's a bit more emphatic than that, a lot more emphatic. Because of his very definition of the creative act is a causal relationship. Now, this brings us to, of course, the climax of our presentation.
Yes.
The modern Western ID movement and New Atheism. Now, what is ID? It doesn't mean, it's not a card you pull out when you want to, when the police stop you on the side of the road. It means intelligent design.
Yes.
But I am calling this the Western ID movement because Islam has and Ibn Taymiyyah loves intelligent design. But we're not going to be critiquing intelligent design. Not at all. God is intelligent and he designed the universe. That is not up to debate. We're going to be looking into the modern Western ID movement and New Atheism. So let us compare these. Intelligent design versus the modern Western ID movement. Now, ID does stand for intelligent design. Okay. The traditional intelligent design argument is what? We've already seen it in the very beginning of our presentation. Nature in its intricacy, regularities, relationships, and purposiveness. All these things we can see in nature shows the knowledge and wisdom of the creator who designed it. The modern Western ID movement, which is what we're going to examine, says this: the irreducibly complex functional structures in nature cannot be accounted for by natural causal processes. And we're going to establish this through their situations. So they're saying that we're going to learn about irreducible complexity. I'm going to get to that. And we're going to learn what it means to not be accounted for by natural causal processes. But before we discuss those things in detail, let's get some background information. How did this thing all begin? Where does the beginning of the modern Western ID movement and New Atheism, where did it have its beginnings? It had its beginnings in something that is strangely called the Enlightenment.
David Hume again.
Yes, he is coming back. Background to the idea, Enlightenment atheism. And the background to that would be Renaissance humanism. We could take it back there, but I don't feel like going that far back in time.
Right.
So David Hume is the first one. Then we have Denis Diderot as well, Paul-Henri Dietrich d'Holbach, and Jacques-André Nagel. These are the four big ringleaders of Enlightenment atheist thought.
Yeah.
Denis Diderot argued that if one abandons the unproven principle the cosmos must have a beginning, then the need to establish the efficient cause of creation is no longer a problem. If the universe doesn't have a beginning, then there's no need to worry about ultimately what causes are. Natural causes are autonomous, basically, is what he's saying, and they can count for themselves. Now, Muslims had argued that the universe has to have a beginning, and that proves God exists, but other Muslims have shown contingency alone is sufficient for that. And that even though Muslims rejected the idea that the universe could be eternal, they also argue that even if you decide that, you still can't get away from God, because the universe is still contingent.
Yeah.
And again, we can see the theme with Paul-Henri Dietrich, who argues that all causation was reduced to patterns of motion. He says that's what causation is, patterns of motion. And man is nothing but a machine devoid of free will. And religion is evil and not just untrue, but dangerous. So that is where he's coming. And all of that comes from the fact that he says causes are autonomous, basically. That causes they have their own autonomy. They can account for things on their own. So this idea that what we call causal autonomy, of where causes do their things without the need for God to be behind them in any way, is where this is coming from. Now, there have been responses to this. I mean, and this developed into three different attitudes that you saw in post-Enlightenment thinking. You had theism. These are the religious people that believe in God and believe God is doing things and active in his creation. And they began arguing this kind of argument. Natural causes cannot account for the complex functional entities in nature. So God is needed as an explanation. Now see, they're not focusing on everything in nature, only very complex things. It's like you can't establish this. So that's where they retreated to this point. They looked for the most difficult and complex things in nature and said, you can't prove this, you can't explain this you can't explain this as having causality. The causality doesn't account for it. Then you have other people that still believe God existed, but they accepted the causal autonomy arguments that were going about since the humanism became prevalent in the Enlightenment. They are called deists, and you mentioned them earlier. Natural causes, they say, can account for the complex functional entities in nature autonomously, but God created in one moment. He packed everything in the first moment, all of the law-abiding rules. He created it in like a clockwork thing that you wind up and create. It just keeps practicing. Even if God disappeared after that and stopped existing, they would say the universe would go on without any problem.
Wow.
And of course, the atheists say, well, you just assume that you need God to pack everything in the beginning because you don't know any better. Maybe we'll have an answer for that later on. So since natural causes can account for everything we see, maybe it can account for the first moment as well, if there is the first moment. So we don't need God at all. And these are the three camps. For the theist camp, a new concept came up called for God to act in nature. Many theists believe God answers prayers and God can do miracles. All the things that traditionally, even before the Enlightenment, believers in God believed. And they talk about God intervening. The idea of intervention, that God can intervene in nature. Because remember, if we're accepting that natural causes are autonomous when they're working, then when they're not working, it's God intervening. So because the natural causes are chugging along, making the universe do what it normally does. Then God, when he wants to do something extraordinary, he intervenes, which doesn't make sense from any of the Sunni perspectives we have, because if everything is God's own action, you can't intervene in your own action. Intervention assumes that something else is going on independently of you, and then you go inside of it. So Muslims should never use a language of intervention, because Muslims know that everything is by God's direct decree and determination, and it's his action. So there's no intervention in your own action. But once you accept that, cause the theists here accept that causality is autonomous when it's happening. Maybe God is sustaining it through a mere conservation model, but it's still going on its own accord. So they say what they say then is there are certain things that cannot be explained by this natural causality, but they do afford it a much greater degree of autonomy than any Muslim theologian within at least Sunni Islam would ever give natural causality. And that's the distinction here that we see. So this is what's happened in post-Enlightenment attitudes about causality in nature and the three different camps that developed. Now we get to the present time, the modern Western ID movement and irreducible complexity. I promised I would explain what that means. This is, according to Michael Behe from his Darwin's Black Box, a single system which is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, and where the removal of any of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Now, this is a perfectly good definition of irreducible complexity. No one will argue that this phenomenon isn't existing. It definitely does exist. There is irreducible complexity. And that is where you have any machine or any process or any object, if you remove one component, the whole thing stops working. Great. No argument here. Very good definition. I hope it's clear. But that's not what he's talking about. That's what he says he's talking about. And I'm going to demonstrate that. That is not, this definition of irreducible complexity is not sufficient for Michael Behe's purposes. And let me show. This is called bridge over water. You see, that's the ground, the brown blocks are the ground, and the blue block in the middle is the water. Okay? Now we get an engineer and say, look, we want people to get from one side to this to the other. It's a high traffic area. No one wants to swim. Please build a bridge. The engineer says, thank you, I will do that for you. Haha, here's your bridge. I hope you like it. Make your check payable to my account, and here's my account. They say, no. Okay, the bridge is working, traffic is flowing. Oh yeah, because people are going across a very heavily trafficked bridge. But this bridge has a lot of problems. First of all, there used to be boats going on that water, and now you've just built the bridge right above the water. The boats can't go under. So you need a submarine to go under that bridge. No, that is not going to suffice. So we've solved the problem of the land traffic, and now the river traffic is backing up. We can't have that. And secondly, what happens at high tide? All the water flows over the top of the bridge. You didn't think about that, Mr. Engineer, did you? You have a point there. Okay, let me tear down the bridge and start over. No. The land traffic is too important. You must keep this bridge operational. You can pause it to make any specific instruction for a short time, but you can't just take the bridge away. We need that bridge. He said, okay, I got this. Trust me. And they don't trust him. But he does this. They said, I don't know what you're doing, Matt. Yeah, the bridge is still there. You just made it longer. What are you doing? You haven't. He said, wait a minute, you told me the bridge has to stay functional at all times. Well, I'm doing it this way. Trust me. Then he puts this block on top. Now the bridge is higher. Okay, you solved the problem of flooding. The bridge doesn't get flooded. You can't, still the boats aren't going underneath. Okay, so trust me. The bridge is, you wanted the bridge to be operational at all times, right? It's operational. Stop complaining. I'm bringing a tugboat now. He brings a tugboat down the river and pushes the little block away. Now you got the bridge you wanted. At high tide, the bridge doesn't flood. At low tide, the boats can go through. And of course, the land traffic goes on uninterrupted from beginning to end. And guess what this bridge is? Let's go back to that definition. A system which is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, and where the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Does that qualify for our bridge here? You can say yes or no.
I'm not going to, it's certainly a bridge. Whether it's irreducibly complex, I wouldn't say it was, no.
By that definition, if I remove any one of the parts, does it continue to function?
No.
So by that definition of irreducible complexity, it has to be irreducible complexity.
Yes, but of course,
Any one of the-
Behe wants to invoke a supernatural, presumably a supernatural.
Yeah, so Behe's, and my point is that definition is not what Behe's concerned about. Irreducible complexity is not what his main concern is.
No, indeed.
We're going to identify his main concern. And also, it's not that the thing has to be functional. The causal relationships between each one of these bridges, if it's a sequence you can see, everything fits. You can get from point A to point B to point C to D and E, step by step by step, until you get to the irreducibly complex result. Yeah. You start with nothing, and you get the result that's irreducibly complex. Where if I remove any one component, the whole thing collapses. Everything can be accounted for. Now we get to the real argument. Causal collapse argument. Michael Behe again from the same book. An irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly. That is, by continuously improving the initial function, which continues to work by the same mechanism. Can't be done. Cannot happen, he's saying. By slight successive modifications of a precursor system. Because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. So he's saying your bridge definition is not what I'm talking about. But what is he talking about? Cannot be produced directly. He's talking about you cannot make a causal account for it. That's what he means. You cannot. Not only is it that it cannot be that you cannot remove a part and it still works, but to get to that point has to be done without a causal explanation. Causal collapse argument.
Yeah.
Again, if you doubted it before, here's him again in Philosophical Objections to Intelligent Design. He says, I claimed that the bacterial flagellum, the bacteria has a little tail on the end that helps it move. I claimed that the bacterial flagellum was irreducibly complex, and therefore required deliberate intelligent design. Why? The flip side of this claim is that the flagellum cannot be produced by natural selection acting on random mutation or any other unintelligent process. Basically, no natural cause and effect relationship will not be there to account for it. Okay? That's what he's saying. Now, for those who are interested, someone has responded to this argument of his, because he argued that a scientist should be able to prove him wrong. He said, if a scientist wants to prove me wrong, they should get some bacteria without flagellums and create pressure for them to develop flagellums and see what happens over many, many generations and make a flagellum happen. Then I will be convinced. Okay? And the response is someone did a computer simulation to see how this would happen. And it would say, determine that it would take no less than 20,000 years to produce the very locus where the flagellum would attach to the bacteria. And to actually create a flagellum in a laboratory that way, the way he's suggesting, would take longer than the recorded history of the human race. But that's their counter argument. Whether it's valid or not is not my concern, but just for interest. Again, in the same article, Philosophical Objections to Intelligent Design, Michael Behe says, my claim for intelligent design requires that no unintelligent process, you're not saying there can't be intelligence behind the process. He said no unintelligent process be sufficient to produce such irreducibly complex systems. So it's not irreducibly complexity that he's worried about. It's establishing causal collapse. He's not saying, and he's not even thinking that maybe there could be an intelligent designer behind the unintelligent process. There cannot be that process.
Okay. And
we can bring William Dembski into this as well. He says, when it comes to reducibly complex biochemical systems, there's no evidence that material mechanisms are causally adequate to bring them about. You cannot account for it purely through causation. Now, Dembski has a slightly different way of dealing with things. He deals with information. So he basically says the complex information that we have in the world today cannot be accounted for causally, at least within the time frame that we have, because its probability of going to him is too low. The merits or demerits of that argument, again, I'm not interested in them, and just the point that ultimately he's saying you cannot account for it causally. Now, why are they going on like this about causation and not being able to account for things causally? Did they just come out of the vacuum? No. They got other people that give them every reason to want to argue them. It's very understandable why they're arguing this way, because of this group here. Now, looking at Richard Dawkins, now we're going to the new atheism. And what is their argument? The causal closure argument. Now, I mentioned causal closure earlier. I say causal closure, so we're going to account for everything having a cause and effect that within any system you're looking at. Now, and I mentioned there's something called hard causal closure, which is basically ontological naturalism. That's cause. Not only can I find a cause for everything, but that's the only level there is. There's nothing else behind it, nothing supernatural, no other explanation. And that's, of course, Richard Dawkins' opinion. And he came up with this idea of calling it the God hypothesis. So God has to be a scientific hypothesis. The God hypothesis, according to Richard Dawkins, is a scientific hypothesis about the universe, which should be analyzed as skeptically as any other. Now, this is really strange, because if God is supernatural by definition, and science can only discover and describe things on a natural level, you kind of like won the game if you're putting it on that level already, because you're saying that we're only going to accept natural causal relationships on the physical level and nothing else, but God has to be proven that way. That's what he's arguing. God has to be proven scientifically, and science only deals with the physical world. Are these guys having a laugh, or are they serious? Oh, they're serious. And I'll show you why they're serious. And we have to go to another character in this group called Victor J. Stenger, who wrote a book to explain this thing that Dawkins said, God, the failed hypothesis. And here's what he has to say about it to explain what's going on. God should be detectable by scientific means simply by virtue of the fact that he is supposed to play such a central role in the operation of the universe and the lives of humans. Existing scientific models contain no place where God is included as an ingredient in order to describe observations. Thus, if God exists, he must appear somewhere within the gaps or errors in scientific models. Now, notice, when I was discussing Michael Behe and other people in the Western ID movement, I never mentioned God of the gaps. It's often brought up with Behe and others that they are invoking God of the gaps arguments, often by these guys to criticize, to say you're talking about gaps in your knowledge, ignorance. Well, they don't consider the gaps there. That's why I use causal breakdown or causal collapse. They're not saying in their own opinions don't think it's an argument from ignorance. They're saying we're trying to establish that causality has to break down.
Yeah.
Their opponents say you're just arguing from ignorance. You just don't know the cause. But what do you expect them to do? This guy's asking. He said, what you need to prove is a gap. I want to see a gap. That's what this side is looking for. That's what Dawkins wants. He wants you to demonstrate a gap in causality. He wants you to demonstrate causal breakdown. He's saying, I argue for causal closure. And because since the Enlightenment, we've decided that causality is autonomous. That means if there is causal closure, which itself is not a problem, but once you have causal autonomy, that natural causation happens autonomously. Once there is causal closure, there's no room for God. We put God in competition with natural causality. When you can describe the cause, you don't need God anymore. So the theists have to retreat to trying to point to places where you cannot describe causality.
Irreducible complexity. Yeah.
Because once you've agreed to the ground rules, so Dawkins and these guys all agree to the same rules. They're playing by the same rules of the game. The rules of the game's finding a gap. Once we find the gap, there's where God is. And not a gap in our knowledge necessarily, but a gap in causality. But this guy's asking for the gap right here. It shows that they can't argue God of the gaps when the guy says what we need to prove the God hypothesis is a gap in causality. Now, I can say one more thing. You could say, David Jalajel, you are not being fair to the new atheist. And they'd be right. They could say neither of these two people, neither Dawkins nor Stenger, none of them could be considered the sharpest crayons in the box when it comes to philosophical theology. It is wrong to judge a philosophical theological movement, and atheism is a theological movement, based on people that are not basically qualified to discuss theology or philosophy. Even though they write books about it, is another issue altogether, but obviously they are nowhere near qualified. If you can't bring somebody better, you really, David Jalajel, should stop talking about the new atheists because you're bringing up the lightweights. So they'd be right. Guilty as charged. Daniel Dennett is a leading philosopher of the mind. He is co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies and the Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University. He's considered one of the leading philosophers of the day. And he's, of course, a new atheist, and he's part of the group. So I think he qualifies to represent the group as a philosopher. And here's what he has to say. A skyhook is a mind-first force or power or process, an exemption to the principle that all design and apparent design is ultimately the result of mindless, motiveless mechanicity. A crane, in contrast, is a sub-process or special feature of a designed process that can be demonstrated to be itself the predictable or retrospectively applicable product of the basic process. A very much more complex, more sophisticated way of speaking. There's no question about that. Now, what has he gone about with skyhooks and cranes? Then it explains that a skyhook is an imaginary contraption firmly attached to the sky. Imagine a hook attached to this, a hook in the air with nothing above it, okay? And the origin of the story is an airplane pilot was commanded to remain in the air for an extra hour. I guess his fuel was running out, and he basically said, this machine is not fitted with skyhooks.
Oh,
you can command me to stay in the air, but I'm not going to be able to stay in the air.
Interesting.
The machine is not fit with skyhooks. And he calls skyhooks miraculous lifters. Basically, once you invoke God or anything else, you're evoking a non-causal entity, a miraculous lifter, to describe some event or some complex thing in nature. These guys are also heavily into looking at the complex things in nature for their arguments. No one's looking at a rock. I mean, women Tamiya would look at a rock, but these guys don't care about that. They're looking at complex things. You can't get from point A to point B in complexity without a skyhook. And he's saying no. Now, the cranes, by contrast, have to be built, he explains, from existing parts in nature, firmly located on existing ground. You can think of a crane goes up and produces a hook that comes down again and can lift the thing to the next level, but it's all firmly rooted in the ground. These are his metaphors, okay? And so what he's basically arguing is that everything must be explained by reduction. It's called reductionism to natural causal processes, and those processes must preclude any other explanation. This is basically ontological naturalism. We've already seen it restated with a couple metaphors. That's all it is. Okay? Otherwise, the creator God, and I quote him on this, the creator God, that God must either be turned into a symbol for something less concrete or abandoned altogether. That's what he concludes from all of this. So there you have it, from their greatest philosopher. I believe he is their greatest philosopher in the movement. It boils down to yes gaps, yes God. No gaps, no God. That, in a nutshell, is what the whole Western ID/New Atheism movement is all about. I am very sorry to disappoint you if you thought there was more to it.
I would just say that Stephen Mayer, who is probably the most prominent, well-known advocate of intelligent design in the West, he has a PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. And he's also confirmed he will be a guest on Blogging Theology in a few weeks' time.
Okay, so he can deal with me.
And you haven't quoted him, but he's by far the most prominent and famous advocate of intelligent design at the moment. And he's just published a book called The Return of the God Hypothesis. That came out just a few months ago. But anyway, watch this space.
Well, I would argue that we never lost it, at least within the Islamic tradition. Okay, conclusion. Modern ID, and again, I'm not talking about intelligent design. I've already established Muslims believe in intelligent design, and they believe it proves many things about God's nature and his attributes, and we firmly hold to it. Modern ID and New Atheism share a common underlying assumption, which I've traced back all the way to the Enlightenment. That which can be accounted for by natural, material, causal processes cannot establish God's existence. I didn't say it means God doesn't exist necessarily. It cannot be used to establish its existence. Therefore, if you can account for something causally, it's not a sign of God. You've got to look for things that you cannot account for causally. And that is the corollary of this. God's existence is established by demonstrating the absence of a natural causal explanation for something in the world. The modern Western ID movement and New Atheism are predicated on an inherent tension between natural causal explanations and God's action. A tension exists. At the very least, there's a tension.
Yeah.
A tension, of course, which we saw doesn't exist for Sunni divine action models, and certainly not for Ibn Taymiyyah. A natural material scientific explanation for something stands in opposition to a theistic explanation of the same thing. If I can account for everything without gaps in any process I'm looking at, that is counter to a theistic explanation, which you saw already that they argued. They said, we want to see gaps. And you see with Behe and them appealing, you cannot explain this or account for this causally. You cannot explain this and account for this through natural causal processes. It's impossible for this to happen by natural causal processes alone. You see that on their side, you see their side. What we want to see is a breakdown in causality. You see that from the New Atheist side. Rules of the game are established. And that explains why what should be a theological question, does God exist or not? It's a theological question. Theologians on both sides can argue it. But they're arguing about whether the Piltdown Man is a hoax, or whether Archaeopteryx is a bird. You see these this is strange kind of theological discussion you're having, because these are the rules they're playing by. The rules are set, and they all basically agree on the ground rules. Now, let us compare Ibn Taymiyyah's knowing God through science in nature versus modern ID and New Atheism on the other side. New Atheism is included on the other column. I just couldn't fit it in the heading. Ibn Taymiyyah's science in nature is grounded in the fitra, our natural disposition. For the modern Western ID movement and their opponents among the New Atheists, it's grounded in rigorous scientific investigation. The issues that you're looking at have to be grounded in scientific explanation and rigor. Where for Ibn Taymiyyah, it's grounded in our innate disposition. Ibn Taymiyyah's science in nature works for all observable entities. You could be looking at a rock, looking at a puddle of water on the ground. It works for that too. Where for the modern Western ID movement and their New Atheist opponents, you're looking at highly complex functional entities that show clear teleology. And how you're going to account for it. One's going to say that this teleology and this functionality of this irreducible complexity shows that it cannot be causally accounted for. And the other side says, no, we will show you that it can be causally accounted for. And the debate between them, can I explain this causally or not? The outcome, the prize, is whether God exists or not. That is a debate that is alien to Muslim divine action models. Requires no formal argumentation for Ibn Taymiyyah, requires a lot of formal argumentation, books of formal argumentation, years of studying molecular biology to be able to do the formal argumentation. For Ibn Taymiyyah, provides immediate necessary knowledge. For him, it doesn't even acquire the basic rudimentary syllogistic form that it does for the Ash'ari. And for the Ash'ari Maturidis, they also agree that the basic rational demands is achieved by a prepubescent child, what's called a rational child, can do the operation. For them, it's still something very early on. It's not something you have to have a PhD in molecular biology to achieve belief in God. But it takes a few extra years before the child will actually come to the conclusion on their own, if their parents are atheists, that God exists. But they should come to that conclusion before they reach puberty. For Ibn Taymiyyah, it comes because it starts with our fitra, and everything in nature necessarily points to it. It doesn't even require any kind of inferential argumentation. It just happens naturally if your heart is pure. But it still comes from the signs in nature. We see it when automatically it falls into place. Is that obvious? Is a positive argument for Ibn Taymiyyah. We see the good thing, we see the beauty in nature, we see the logic, we see the wisdom, we see how everything is working, everything's dependent, and we realize God exists. For modern Western ID and New Atheists, the arguments are negative. You cannot account for this causally. You cannot explain this. This cannot be explained except by God. So it comes from a very negative look. You try to find things where you can negate causality. That is what you're looking to do. So it's not a positive argument, it's a negative argument. And this is, of course, the most important thing, which I think we should, in our summary, this is where I'll drill in the most. Causal relationships are from God's design. For the other side, causal relationships do not support design. This is the most fundamental break. For Ibn Taymiyyah, he would think Dawkins is insane. He would say, you are saying God doesn't exist, Mr. Dawkins, with all due respect, because you see causal relationships in nature. God's action is a causal relationship in nature. When God creates ash, he creates ash how? He creates potencies in matter. That's what God does. He creates matter and gives it its potencies. And through those potencies, he brings about his creation. What you're seeing is God's creative act. You say to me, Mr. Dawkins, everywhere you look, you see cause and effect. You never see a break. You never see any deficiency. You cannot find, you say, in nature, one instance where an effect doesn't have a cause. And you say God doesn't exist. Everything you see is perfectly seamlessly working through cause and effect. God's action everywhere you turn, without break, without deficiency, without defect. And you say God doesn't exist. The very same thing Richard Dawkins is using to say God doesn't exist is the very same thing Ibn Taymiyyah says is God's action in nature. What you're seeing here is a complete opposite paradigm. You're looking at the same phenomenon, but having the opposite perspective. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the very thing, causal closure, that is being used by the new atheists and countered by their opponents, is the very thing that should be manifesting God's existence, the perfect order of the perfect creator's perfectly created universe. And you're saying God doesn't exist. And then he said, oh, Mr. Behe, he would say, no, you don't get away either. You're trying to tell me that you're going to prove God exists by showing me the collapse of causality, by showing me a breakdown in the causal order. God's action in nature, you're going to say, I want to not see it. I want an instance where I'm not seeing God's action, where I know it can't be happening, and that's how you're going to prove God exists. Again, what you're looking at really is more fundamental than the debate between the atheist and the ID people. You're looking at a civilizational difference, and not one that's always been the case. One that's been the case, I would say, since the Enlightenment. A totally different way of looking at the world. One way creates inherent conflict between science and religion, because you're putting God in competition with nature. By saying that anytime I can show a cause and effect relationship, I don't need to account for God. It's not a sign of God. Remember what Ibn Qayyim said at the very beginning, causes and catalysts are signs of God. They're saying, great, when I can explain it causally, I don't need God. You saw that with Diderot. You saw that with the time of Hume. You saw that was their argument. And you saw the counter argument is, we will show you complex things that cannot be explained through causality. That entire mental picture is alien to all three Sunni divine action models. And I picked him in Taymiyyah's because even though it's hostile to all three, he is as diametrically opposed to that way of thinking. If the causal relationship is God's creative act manifested before your eyes, it's diametrically opposed to the assumptions in contemporary Western discourse on the topic. Finally, physical conclusions drawn from nature are distinct from the metaphysical conclusions. I think we discussed that earlier. Wherefore, the people on the other side, they're confusing the two. Physical conclusions drawn from nature are confused with metaphysical conclusions. Yes, you can determine that on the physical level, fire burns cotton. And you can not just determine that, you can talk about the chemical relationships. What science has done is taking what used to be rudimentary relationships that we saw. I see fire, I see cotton, I see burning. But now I can describe it on the molecular level, on the chemical level, transfer of heat, the chemical changes that take place in the cotton. I can describe these causal relationships on finer and finer and finer and finer and finer and finer levels, maybe down to the quantum level, the subatomic level. And I think I'm clever. I think I have all the answers, but I have none of the answers. I have nothing metaphysical there. Physical, because of the precision and unbelievable increase in our knowledge of the physical relationships between things in nature, which is all science can ever give you. I believe I can pontificate on the metaphysical on that basis and declare God doesn't exist. You're confusing knowledge of physical relationships with actual metaphysical knowledge. And that is, of course, why these people think that they can argue with science to prove metaphysical claims of this nature. Not arguing from nature. Yes, the signs in nature do prove God exists, but there's a different way of thinking there. It's not just how much information I can accumulate that I can discount God or prove God. It's the fact that these explanations all point from the simple rock sitting on your table to the most complex phenomenon in the universe, all point to the fact that somebody else is out there that is bringing this about. And that is the signs in nature that we see. And of course, here is my bibliography. These books, I believe, I'll leave this up there. I won't read them out, but anybody can pause the video and look at it. And all of these works will be a very big help for anybody who wishes to pursue these topics further. And I thank you very much for your time.
Wow. Well, that was an awesome presentation, David. Thank you very much indeed for that. That's an incredible resource for everyone, for students and viewers in the years to come. So those slides are absolutely fascinating. And thanks for that bibliography as well. I've already said that Raymond Harvey's book, Transcendent God, Rational Word, and Maturidi Theology, is available free of charge officially from Edinburgh University Press. This was just announced a few days ago officially. You don't have to pay for it. It's been generously funded by the Templeton Foundation, so you can quite legally do that. A couple of works by John Hoover, who, of course, who is one of perhaps the world's leading English-speaking authority on Ibn Taymiyyah, is professor at Nottingham University here in England. And there's others as well. Oh, the one at the top, by the way, on Ibn Taymiyyah is also, I think it's his PhD thesis, is actually...
I believe it's also a free open access.
Oh, is it?
If I'm wrong. But
Oh,
I
hope you're right, because it's really
yeah.
expensive to buy on
yes, it is.
That's why I didn't buy it. But oh, if that's now open access, that's even better.
I'm pretty sure it is also open access. If you can
oh, really? Oh, well, that's amazing news. Then I'll certainly get hold of that.
If I'm wrong, I'm very sorry, but I truly believe it.
We'll sue you. No, that's no. I'll certainly I'll get that.
Very good read. He's taken the Dorata Arad, one of those big thick books like this big.
Oh yeah, I've
he read every single word of it and maps it out in a study. It's so yes, I definitely recommend it for anyone.
Dr. Yasser Qadhi, by the way, his PhD thesis at Harvard was based on that very book. You can also read that PhD thesis online, which I've done. That's a fascinating study of Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology, basically, a lovely work. So thank you I won't go on, but thank you very much indeed, sir, for your outstanding presentation. And I'm very honored and privileged that you've done it on our platform. So thank you very much then, and until next time.
Thank you for having me on, and pray that it works into the benefit of everyone who watches.
Okay, thank you.